I don't think people grasp the whole me when they see me on television or in the pages of some glossy magazine. I've got the wonderful family, the big house, the flash car in the drive. I run several of the world's best restaurants. I'm running around cursing and swearing, telling people what to do, my mouth always getting me into trouble. They probably think, that flash bastard. I know I would. But it's not about being flash. My life, like most people's, is about keeping the wolf from the door. It's about hard work, it's about success. Beyond that, though, something else is at play. Is it fear? Maybe. I'm as driven as any man you'll ever meet. This is an excerpt from the book we're going to talk about today, Humble Pie by Gordon Ramsay.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches, and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Duncan Simpson, and you've just heard from Dr. Greg Young. As sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindset, strategies, and habits that propelled the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. Our goal is to help you learn from history's greatest performers. For each episode, we read and condense entire autobiographies into concentrated insights, representing over 20 hours of work per episode. You gain not only the collective wisdom of these elite performers, but also access to over 30 years of our professional expertise in sports psychology. Listening to this, you are saving countless hours while accessing the distilled wisdom and proven strategies of the best in their fields. So, as I've just mentioned, these podcasts take a ton of time and effort to execute. If you find value in what we're doing here and want to show your appreciation, help support us by clicking the donate button in the link in the show notes. This will help us keep the show going.
Yeah, this is something new we're trying, and of course, we truly appreciate your support.
So, Greg, we're once again stepping outside the world of sport. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Gordon Ramsay and his accomplishments?
Well, Gordon Ramsay is probably a pretty well-known figure to most of our listeners, but let's run through a few things. So in terms of his culinary career and his achievements there, in terms of Michelin stars, which are the gold standard of restaurants and restaurateurs, he's earned 17 Michelin stars across his restaurants over the years. He's the youngest 3-star chef in the United Kingdom. At 35, his restaurant Gordon Ramsay in London earned 3 Michelin stars, making him the youngest British chef to achieve this feat. He has a global restaurant empire and owns and operates 58 restaurants worldwide, including obvious places: London, Paris, Vegas, Dubai, and Singapore. Duncan, I'm sure you've been to them all. In terms of his television and media work, hosts some iconic TV shows, things like Hell's Kitchen, Kitchen Nightmares, MasterChef Junior, Hotel Hell, and Gordon Ramsay Uncharted. He's an Emmy Award winner. He won Outstanding Host for a reality or competition program for MasterChef Junior, and he has a massive digital presence as well. He has YouTube cooking tutorials, which I'm sure you've taken, Duncan. I know I've used them. Hundreds of millions of views, TikTok, Instagram. These are churning out millions and millions daily. So in terms of his business and his branding, actually outside of the kitchen, the Gordon Ramsay Group, which is his hospitality group, that generates hundreds of millions in revenue year after year. In terms of product lines, he's got a little bit of everything. He's got cookware, kitchenware, branded food products. Interestingly, he's also invested in esports and some food startups. So he's partnered with different brands beyond the restaurant industry as well to continue to grow that brand. And some things that you might not necessarily be aware of here, Duncan, in terms of his personal life and his philanthropic work, he's a black belt in karate. So he's trained in martial arts, sort of a disciplined persona that he has that we'll certainly learn about. Furthermore, with that, he's an Ironman and marathon competitor, and he's completed multiple Ironman triathlons and marathons, and he's done a lot of charity work, like I said, a big philanthropist. And he's an honorary OBE, which is an Order of the British Empire. He received this award in 2006 for his services to the hospitality industry. He's actually in the Culinary Hall of Fame as well. In 2013, he was inducted to the Culinary Hall of Fame, cementing his status as one of the industry's most influential figures. So quite the list there.
Greg, without doubt, Gordon Ramsay is a high performer, not only in the culinary world, but also in entertainment and business. Our purpose is to learn from history's greatest performers. And I heard it said a different way the other day, and it really stuck with me. It was, pick an extreme example of success and ask, what the hell happened here? And I think Gordon Ramsay is an example of extreme success.
I love that. It really captures what we're trying to do here and the curiosity that we have at the heart of everything. I love that. So shall we jump in and learn how the hell he did that?
Absolutely.
All right. So he starts, what kind of people were my parents? Dad was a hard-drinking womanizer, a man to whom it was impossible to say no. He was competitive, as much with his children as anyone else. And he was gobby, very gobby. He prided himself on telling the truth, even though he was in no position to lecture other people. Mum was, and still is, softer, more innocent, though tough underneath it all. She had to be over the years. I was named after my father, another Gordon, but I like to think I look more like her. The fair hair, the squashy face. I have her strength too, the ability to keep going no matter whatever life throws at you. Duncan, his parents were married when his mum was just 17 years old, and his mum was madly in love with him, but his dad had a drinking problem, definitely a temper, and of course, as I mentioned there, was a womanizer. Gordon says, one night when mum was 6 months pregnant, a neighbour had to call the police as dad was dishing out some domestic violence on mum. He was taken away. Mum was taken to hospital and ended up signing consent forms for the three of us to be taken into a care home for 10 days. She visited every day. Then dad was released and he came back home. So his dad, obviously a very interesting person to say the least, he couldn't necessarily hold down a job and was sort of bouncing around things, and he borrowed money from loan sharks to try and fund his next scheme or his wild adventure, which often actually focused around music and trying to start a band and get that off the ground. To be honest, he was a bit of a wheeler dealer, a little bit of a sort of a Del Boy type for our British listeners, and the family were always on the move as a result of this, so they were bouncing around from city to city. Gordon was actually born in Glasgow, where his mum and dad were married, and they've just bounced around all over the place. And when his dad got into trouble, of course that had an impact on the kids. He says, I think we built up a lot of insecurity as children. I used to find it so intimidating, walking into yet another new school. Academically, we were never in one place long enough to develop any kind of attention span, and in any case, Dad was hardly the kind of man to insist on you doing your homework. Only Puffs did homework. The same way only Puffs went into catering. No, he was much more interested in trying to turn us into a country version of the Osmonds. Diane, Ronnie and Yvonne, my younger sister, all sing and play musical instruments. They didn't really have a choice about that. Dad was obsessed. But something in me wasn't having it, and I never went along with his plan. That's not to say I wasn't just as scared of him as they were. My tactic was to keep my head down and my nose clean. I never drank or smoked, and when I was asked to lug his bloody gear about the place, I just got on with the job. It's ironic, really, that people think of me as so forceful and combative, a real aggressive bastard, because that's the precise opposite of how I was as a kid. Until I was big enough to take him on in a fight, I wouldn't have said boo to a goose. So it sounds, Duncan, very much like his dad was a very, very difficult character to grow up with.
Greg, there's a quote that I came across recently by Francis Ford Coppola, the famous movie director, that says, the story of the son is always embedded in the story of the father. And I think this rings true when we think about Gordon Ramsay and even some of our previous performers. Their relationship with their fathers, whether it was very supportive, strained, or toxic, as it sounds like here, the relationship with the father has really profoundly shaped their past. And as I've said before, I've never seen a strong person with an easy past. And it's very obvious that Gordon had a super tough upbringing and his father was the cause of that.
Without a shadow of a doubt. His dad does play a pretty strong role throughout the book and pops up in various different shapes, forms and fashions. But I think what you're saying, it is quite profound that he has in fact definitely shaped Gordon's path here. So his dad eventually kicks Gordon out of his house around 16-year-old, and this next section summarizes their relationship. He says, journalists have often asked me whether I loved Dad, whether I had any love at all in my heart for him. The truth is that any time I tried to get close, I'd just come up against this competitive streak in him. Later, my feelings for him hardened into hatred. Everything he did, I was determined to do the opposite. I never wanted to follow in his footsteps, and that's why I never picked up a fucking guitar, and that's why I never sat at a fucking piano. Were there any good times? Not really. I suppose the only thing that I really admired about him was the fact that he was a fisherman. He was a great fisherman, there's no two ways about it. But even that got tainted by all the other stuff. Anything to add here, Doug?
I think what clearly stands out is that Gordon's intense drive and ambition weren't just about success. They're actually about creating distance from his father and his legacy. His father was not successful. And like you said, it was a bit of a wheeler and dealer. And I think Gordon was driven to be as successful as possible. And it makes me wonder how many high performers that we've discussed have been fueled not only by what they're moving towards perhaps, but also what they're desperately trying to get away from. And he's definitely trying to distance himself from his dad.
That's a really nice way to put it. I like that. Not just what they're moving towards, but what they're moving away from. So Gordon was a very talented football player, soccer player, and he found this as a sort of a small way to connect with his dad, who was a huge Glasgow Rangers fan, obviously born and brought up in that area. And, you know, Gordon was a very good junior footballer, and he got picked to play for his county, Warwickshire, and then Oxfordshire. And then he moved and eventually got an opportunity at that familiar place in Glasgow, where he went on trial at Glasgow Rangers. Talking about that trial, he said, "That first week was hard. I didn't have a good time at all. I had an English accent for one thing, so basically they just kicked the shit out of me for that. And they also made me use my right leg, which was fucking useless. We weren't allowed to rely on only one foot. In much the same way as, in the kitchen, you must be able to chop with both hands. I'm naturally left-handed, but I can chop and peel with my right hand, so if I cut myself, I'm okay, I'm prepared." Anyway, after that first week, I came back and I just hated Rangers. I hated the guts out of them. I had no problem with the training. I'd never been afraid of hard work. But then, in the afternoons, after training, we'd gone to play snooker and eat for Britain. Food in Scotland was bad. Then, unbelievably bad. It still is in most cases. It was pie and gravy, pie and beans, or what the Scottish call a slice. These big, square, processed slabs of sausage meat. Fucking hell. I didn't have what you could call a sophisticated palate, but I couldn't stand it. And although I was in digs with the other lads, I was very lonely. I wished I had a Scottish accent, something that would have made them feel more comfortable around me. So Duncan, his football career didn't really pan out the way that he wanted it to pan out, because unfortunately he got some pretty serious injuries, including a good old-fashioned ACL, a cruciate knee injury, and also randomly a ruptured spleen.
Bloody hell, that must have been one hell of a tackle to rupture your spleen.
Yeah, those two were separate incidents, by the way. It's going to be a hell of a challenge to rupture your ACL and your spleen. Separate incidences, but obviously the spleen led to surgery, and after surgery had an abscess, and that basically put him out for 3 months. So, you know, he's clearly been afflicted with major injuries. This meant that football wasn't going to work out for him. And he describes that. Come the start of the new season, there was no getting away from it. My leg was just not the same, and it had become apparent to my bosses, Jock Wallace, the club's manager, and his assistant, Archie Knox. They called me into my office one Friday morning to give me the bad news. It was all over for me. I wasn't going to be signed. I was not going to play European or even First Division football. I remember their words coming at me like physical blows. It was so hard to take, but I was determined not to show how broken I felt inside. Years of standing up to Dad had put me in good stead for this performance. I might have wanted to cry or to shout or to punch the nearest wall, but I was damned if I was going to do that in front of these two. I admired Jock, and I'd always been intimidated by him. I certainly wasn't going to let the side down now. I gripped my chair, and I waited for the whole thing to be over. In those few minutes, all my dreams died. Part of me was wondering how I could manage to walk out of the room. Looking back on this time, I'm struck once again by the cruelty of my father, and the way he dominated everything I did, even my football. I loved the game, but my involvement wasn't about becoming a famous player with flash cars and flash houses and women hanging on my every word. It had so much more to do with proving myself to my father. Duncan, I think this is the first time we're hearing about a complete change in careers from one of our performers.
Yeah, I think if you're listening to this about Gordon Ramsay, you're probably like, what the hell? He was a footballer, he was a soccer player. But yes, we're talking about the same person. Gordon Ramsay, the famous chef, nearly made it as a professional soccer player. But Greg, I think you're right. It's the first time we've discussed such a dramatic pivot in someone's career. I don't think we've identified another performer that was on one clear path to being an elite performer and then completely pivoted. Gordon's injury obviously forced him to give up those footballing dreams, something that it's clear that he invested his entire identity in, and it was really connected back to his dad. It's also an important reminder that sometimes setbacks can open doors to greatness we couldn't have previously imagined. In that moment, he said, my dreams died, right? And he doesn't know it yet, but he's going to be on a completely new path. So Gordon Ramsay wouldn't have become one of the world's great chefs if football hadn't ended so abruptly. And I think for me, it prompts me to reflect that, sometimes our biggest disappointments can actually become our greatest opportunities. You just don't know what that door may open to. You just have to be open and curious.
I love that. And that's a really great transition into this section. He says, I latched on the idea of catering college because my options were limited, to say the least. I didn't know if football would work out. I looked at the Navy and the police, but I didn't have enough O-levels to join either of them. As for the Marines, my little brother Ronnie was joining the army, and I couldn't face the idea of competing with him. So I ended up enrolling on a foundation year in catering at a local college, sponsored by the Rotarians. It was an accident, a complete accident. Did I dream of being a Michelin-starred chef? Did I fuck? So Duncan, when did the dream start, you may ask?
Well, when did the dream start, Greg?
That is a great question. I feel like I might have teed you up for that. So here we go. Diane, the sister, got me a job working at the hotel where she was a waitress. Again, I was only washing up, but that was when I got the first idea of becoming a chef. I was in the kitchen listening to all the noise, and I was fascinated. I couldn't believe the way people were shouting at each other. I was working like a fucking donkey, but the time used to fly by. I was enraptured. Something's gripped him here, hasn't it, Duncan?
Yeah, it's fascinating how sometimes we find our calling by accident. As he said, he didn't have this plan. Gordon wasn't looking to become a chef, he was just washing dishes. But something about that kitchen's intensity, it seems like it really spoke to him deeply. He discovered a passion in a really unexpected place, which reminds us that the key isn't always to chase passion directly, but to remain open to sometimes letting passion find us. He didn't imagine this was going to be his path. And all of a sudden, as we've talked about in previous episodes, a spark has been lit here.
Absolutely, and in a pretty unlikely place, right? You don't think as a pot washer, someone's got their hands in cleaning dirty dishes is going to get that sort of that spark and want to push on. So just as a bit of a note here, Duncan, the life or the career rather of a chef is very, very different to that of an athlete. Somewhat I wasn't necessarily aware of until I read this book. So while a football player, perfect example with Gordon, might be on like a 3-year contract at a club, or in some places a lot of players spend their entire careers in one place at one club. Chefs actually bounce around and move from kitchen to kitchen, and they pick up new skills, new experiences, new techniques, new influences, and definitely new mentors as well on that way. So Gordon's journey is no different to this. So after his stint as a pot washer in a curry house and then to the hotel, as I've just mentioned, then the Roxburgh House Hotel, where he moved up to actually cooking as a commis chef. He was there for about 6 months before moving on to a place called the Wickham Arms, which was owned by a couple, and he actually got to live above the restaurant here. This lasted about 6 months as well, but not because of anything particularly in the kitchen. The food was pretty good, but actually because he spent those 6 months shagging the owner's wife. So not to tell the entire tale, the book does a really nice job of that, and it doesn't really suit our purpose here. But that led to a fight later on at one of Gordon's actual restaurants when the kind of the husband confronted him. Now that's a hell of a way to leave a job. So following that, he moved to London to the Mayfield Hotel as a second commis chef. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the French Brigade, a commis is a junior member of the kitchen staff, sometimes often a trainee, and that's someone who assists senior chefs with food prep, with cooking, and kind of ensuring the kitchen runs smoothly, but always works under the guidance of a chef de partie, which is sort of a station chef. So you might be working on this meat station or the fish station or veg, that sort of stuff. So a little bit of context there for you. While at the Mayfair, he actually disagreed with the way that they were scrambling eggs in the morning. They were being made sort of in big batches in a big bain-marie, and he said they were like rubber. So he actually decided to take matters into his own hands. And here's a little bit about that. He says, naturally, like a true goody two-shoes, I said, look, I'm on breakfast this morning, and I'm going to make all the scrambled eggs to order, chef. And that's exactly what I did. Though I got fucked when I came back from my day off because there'd been so many complaints about how slow the breakfasts had been. But chef, I said, I may have been a bit slow, but at least they weren't rubber eggs. They were freshly made to order. He wasn't having any of it. I don't give a fuck, he says. We had to knock about 25 breakfasts off bills. I got such a bollocking, a written warning, in fact. But when he gave it to me, in a funny way, it was helpful. It was there in black and white that I was working in a place that wasn't for me. A place where you got a warning for failing to cook crap scrambled eggs. I knew I had to get out. Duncan, I think it's a great story, but there's a clue or a little glimpse into his mindset here. He wasn't willing to make poor food.
Exactly. What's so telling here is Gordon's refusal to compromise on quality. Even early in his career, he'd rather face criticism for being too slow than accept doing something poorly. This clarity of standards, Greg, really set the foundation for everything that followed. His mindset was simple. If you're going to do something, I think do it right. The lesson here is powerful. Elite performers have non-negotiable standards, and they're willing to take the heat rather than lower those standards. Ramsay's whole career reflects this idea that excellence is a choice that you affirm every single day, and for him, every single time he steps into the kitchen.
I love that. I'm going to repeat that for listeners. Excellence is a choice that you reaffirm every single day. So, of course, as he is a chef, he decides to move on. So he moves on to a place called Maxime de Paris. During a break, he goes into a little bit of a sort of a lounge space. He grabs a magazine and he takes it out into the garden in Soho Square. Christ, I said to myself, there's Jesus. Because on the cover was a photo of Marco Pierre White, all long hair and bruised looking eyes. He was 25. He'd come from a council estate in Leeds. And then, when I looked at who he'd worked with and where, Nico Ladinis, Raymond Blanc, Le Taint Clair, and La Gavroche, I thought, fuck me, he's worked for all the best chefs in Britain. I want to go and work with him. I phoned him up there and then. Where are you working now, he said. So I told him. Well, it must be a fucking shithole because Alistair Little is the only place that I know in Soho, and if you're not working there, don't bother coming. I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I told him, without even really thinking about it, that I was about to go to France because I wanted to learn how to cook properly. Have you got a job out there, he asked. No, not yet. Then come and see me tomorrow morning. I left the phone box and went back to the restaurant. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I turned up at what would become the legendary Harvey's the following day, as requested. We're talking about the earliest days of the restaurant. It had only been open about 6 months, and it would be another 6 months before it got its first Michelin star. I suppose I expected to walk in and see him sitting at a table, writing menus or something. Not a bit of it. I walked into this dingy alleyway, and I said to a guy who was standing there, "Can I speak to Marco?" The guy turned around and looked at me. It was him. Duncan, I love how he's just taken a chance here and just called the Marco Pierre White.
First of all, Marco Pierre White comes from a council estate in Leeds. I've lived in Leeds.
I didn't realize that either. It's Italian heritage, and I don't know. Is there a big? You're from that neck of the woods. Is there a big Italian population in?
I've never heard of anyone called Marco in Leeds before. That kind of stood out for me. I thought, oh, he must be from Europe somewhere. Well, anyway, I think this moment, if I get back to the story, I think this moment catches something that we've often seen in our elite performers. This willingness to step out of the comfort zone. He didn't hesitate or overthink it. He took immediate action, even though he wasn't fully prepared. He saw the magazine. He was like, okay, I'm going to give him I'm going to give him a call. His mindset was clear. To become great, you need to surround yourself with greatness. And there's another important lesson in here. Extraordinary opportunities rarely appear on your own. You have to reach out and grab them, even if you're unsure and intimidated. Gordon's spontaneous call to Marco Pierre White really set his career on a whole new trajectory, reinforcing how a really simple act of courage can really be the difference in a life story. I mean, we've talked about these pivotal moments, and again, he's just decided to go out of his comfort zone, give a guy a call, and all of a sudden his career takes off.
As if it was just that easy. You know what I mean? I've seen him in the magazine. I'm just going to give him a buzz because that's how simple life is. But of course, this is it's a seminal moment, to be honest. He says, finally, he took me through to the dining room there, sat me down and gave me a coffee. Look, he said, we work so fucking hard here. This kitchen will be your life. There's no social life, no girlfriends, and it's shit money. Do you want to leave now? No, not at all. So that was it. Next thing, he's telling me to get changed and come into the kitchen. He was making pasta. I'd never made pasta in my life. He showed me how to do a ravioli. He showed me how to do a tortellini. Then I had a go. Those aren't going on the menu, he said. They aren't perfect. But things are moving pretty quickly here. So even if I was clumsy, I was determined to get there in the end. Your fingers move fast, he said. Do you want a job? Yeah, I'd love a job. You start Monday. But Monday was going to be a problem. I've got to give a month's notice, I said. Well, if you really want the job that fucking badly, you'll start Monday. I was shitting myself, but there was nothing for it. Later on that day, I phoned him and told him the people at Braganza were refusing to pay me that month's salary unless I worked my notice. I've got this to pay and I've got that to pay, I said. I'm going to have to stay put. What hours are you working? I'm on earlies for the next month. Problem solved. I did the early shift at Braganza from 7 a.m. until 4 p.m. and then got the tube to Victoria and the train from there to Wandsworth Common, where I'd work at Harvey's until about 2 o'clock in the following morning. I kept this up for the whole month. I had no choice. It turned out that Marco's warning about the restaurant taking over my life was only the half of it. Whew, Duncan, we're seeing the unglamorous and early stages of a career here.
Definitely, and I've used that maxim before that time is a form of capital equally distributed to everyone. And here, this passage really shows that he's doing something that no one else is prepared to do. By my calculations, and I don't like to do public math,
Or public maths coming back. Public maths coming back.
he's finishing at 2 a.m. in the morning and then he's starting his next job at 7 a.m. And, maybe he's getting in 4 or 5 hours of sleep and it's rinse and repeat. This passage is a powerful reminder of the hidden side of success, those grueling, unglamorous early stages that most people never see. Ramsay was working these brutal hours, balancing two demanding jobs and facing exhaustion. Yet he did it willingly because he understood that, honestly, this is the price of admission. This is the price of admission to get into Marco Pierre White's kitchen. And it's a theme that we've seen repeatedly. Greatness often emerges from moments when you're willing to embrace the hardship that others won't do. When we reflect on people like Lance Armstrong and Des Linden, they were prepared to push themselves from an endurance perspective to a level that others just weren't prepared to go. And I think Gordon's story here isn't about talent alone. It's, again, that message and that lesson of sacrifice and resilience and an unwavering commitment to his larger goal. It's a critical lesson. Success demands far more than people even imagine. It demands all of you.
It is definitely a transition for him moving into this role. And he says, in the beginning, I admired Marco more than I can say. His cooking left me speechless. The lightness, the control, the fact that everything was made to order. In the kitchen, there'd be 6 portions of beef or sea bass or tagliatelle, not 50. Everything was so fresh. Everything was made to order. It was as if I was putting on my first pair of football boots all over again. I felt very low on the ladder. Speed-wise, I was fine. My knife skills were great. But everything else I'd learned, I had to forget fast. Everything we produced had such great integrity. It was clean, honest food, and it tasted phenomenal. You'd taste a sauce 10, maybe 15 times for a single portion. Then you'd start all over again when the next table's order came in. 1 portion, 1 sauce. Pooh, Duncan, this is high performance at work here.
Experience in Marco's kitchen highlights a crucial high performance principle that mastery comes from that relentless repetition, precision, precise attention to detail, and absolute integrity in the process. Notice how Gordon compares it to putting on football boots for the first time. He's back at the bottom of the ladder, relearning fundamentals, and his willingness to start over, to unlearn and relearn. It's vital in true greatness. Ramsay's commitment here, precision, freshness, and perfection of each dish. This is what elite performance looks like up close. Uncompromising standards and a relentless pursuit of excellence, one dish at a time. I just love this.
Duncan, we talk about relentless pressure environments in high performance pretty much all the time. And we hear just how unrelenting a Marco Pierre White kitchen is, even though the amount of development going on in there is absolutely astronomical. He says, but it was the toughest place to work that you could imagine. You had to push yourself to the limit every day and every night. You had to learn to take a lot of shit and to bite your lip and work even harder when that happened. A lot of the boys couldn't take the pace. They fell by the wayside. When that happened, you felt that you had been able to survive what they hadn't. Marco was running a dictatorship. His word, and his word alone, was all that mattered. He fancied himself as a kind of mafioso, dark and brooding and fucking terrifying. He had favourites. And then they'd be out in the cold. He'd praise you, and then he'd knock you down. He would abuse you mentally and physically. He would appear when you were least expecting him, silently. His mood swings were unbelievable. One minute he was all smiles, ruffling your hair, practically pinching your cheek. The next, he was throwing a pan across the kitchen. Often, the pan would be full. Stock everywhere. Or boiling water, or soup. But you wouldn't say anything. You'd wait for the quiet after the storm, and then you'd clear up. No questions asked. Duncan, we've said it before that high performance environments, they're not meant for everyone. And that is what we're seeing here.
This catches something critical we've highlighted before, Greg. Like you just said, elite environments aren't comfortable. And they're certainly not for everyone. The intensity that Gordon describes here is extreme and often harsh and volatile and, as he says, exhausting. Yet there's something oddly appealing about knowing that you've survived what others couldn't. I think that can build a sense of resilience and pride as you kind of hear it in his voice here. But it's also a reminder that high performance environments walk a fine line between pushing people to excellence and breaking them down.
You're spot on there. I think high performance environments, they always demand a price, but the best ones create pressure that builds rather than breaks individuals. And the question that we need to ask ourselves as leaders or coaches or people in positions of power, as it were, is how can we push our people towards excellent without crossing that line into that toxicity, as you mentioned? High performance doesn't have to mean dysfunction, far from it. But too often, unfortunately, it does. And I think it's our responsibility to know the difference. The term you've used in the past is unacceptable success. And that is something that we have to consider. I think this is definitely our way to build resilience and hard work and standards, but it's not the only way. So that leads us nicely into this. We were all young and insecure, and he played on that. A lot of us were guys with a lot of baggage. You'd find out about your home life while you stood there peeling your asparagus or your baby potatoes. Then, 4 hours later, when you were in the middle of a service and you'd screwed up, he would say, I fucking told you you were a shit cook. You can't fucking roast a pigeon because you're too busy worrying about your mum and dad's divorce. One time he turned around and said to me, you know the best thing that's happened to you, Ramsay? The shit that ran down your mother's leg when you were born. But if you answered back, you only made things worse. Once, he was telling us all some outlandish story about jumping off a train. Everyone was laughing. But then I said, bullshit. He picked up his knife. Then he threw it down. Then he grabbed me and put me up against the wall. It was almost like being back at home with Dad. Maybe that's how I was able to put up with it for so long. Duncan, this very much for me sounds unacceptable, and it sounds like it's crossed that line at the toxicity.
The fact that Gordon relates his experiences here directly back to the abuse from his father is really powerful. I think it reminds us that some performers might tolerate toxic environments because tragically it's actually familiar to them, as he alludes to. As leaders or coaches, we must recognize our immense responsibilities. Success built through manipulation, humiliation, or emotional abuse isn't true success. It's harmful and ultimately unsustainable. Our job is actually to create an environment where people can thrive, not just one where they can survive.
Yeah, I mean, I know we haven't both worked in a kitchen environment, certainly one that has a toxic reputation, but I know there are other ways to get the same result. The performance environment may change, but human nature doesn't change, and we definitely don't need to glorify abuse at all. Unfortunately, this kind of behaviour is something that Gordon mimics on his TV shows. He goes on to say, I stayed at Harvey's for 2 years and 10 months. It was a massive learning curve for me, and it completely changed the way that I cooked. The trouble was that Marco made you feel as though there was nothing outside of Harvey's, that nowhere else mattered. That was just not true. Even if I hadn't been sick to the bottom of my stomach of the rages and the bullying and the violence, I needed to spread my wings if I was ever going to become the kind of cook I now so desperately wanted to be. And that is exactly what I did next. So Duncan, he does leave Harvey's and he desperately wants to work in France. If you remember, before he actually joined Harvey's, he talked about that desire. But Marco Pierre White convinces him to turn down a job with Alain Ducasse and actually take a job in London at La Gavroche with the legendary Albert Roux of the world-famous Roux family. But he was back to being a commis chef and actually on less money. So he would actually go and work at Harvey's on Saturdays, allowing Marco to take the night off and basically run that entire kitchen in his absence for 50 quid, which sounds like a bargain to get Gordon Ramsay to cook for you. Albert Roux asked him to work with him in Hotel Diva in the French Alps for a season as his number 2 in the kitchen. Following that season, he finally made it to Paris to Guy Savoy, which had 2 Michelin stars. And he says about Paris, Paris was wonderful. Scurrying around the markets, working in the cafes, learning how to make lattes and cappuccinos, or turning out a decent salad. Just discovering how to do the simplest things correctly. But I was so hard up. After I'd paid my share of the rent, I had about 80 quid left a month. It was humiliating in a way, like being back at school and getting my free. Under French law, my employer was required to give me back half of my metro fare. So every Monday, I had to go up with my little orange tickets to get back my 10 francs. Still, I had a massive sense of purpose. This was where I was meant to be. Duncan, again, he's stepping outside of this comfort zone by leaving Harvey's and obviously going to France and then ending up in Paris, as he knew that he needed to learn more. Another real sign of a high performer here.
Exactly, Greg. High performers recognize when they've stopped growing and they embrace discomfort to keep progressing. The move to Paris, where he basically had to start over, he's struggling financially, but he is mastering even basic skills. And this underlines a lesson that we've seen repeatedly. Elite performers prioritize growth over comfort. and they're willing to sacrifice short-term stability for long-term mastery. We've said it before, but it fits perfectly here. You can't discover new lands without losing the sight of the shore, and he's literally left Great Britain and found his shore in Paris.
Yeah, that is a great example of the principle that we've highlighted before, which is growth begins at the edge of your comfort zone. And I think that's a real takeaway here. For listeners, don't fear discomfort, lean into it, because that's often where your great breakthroughs occur. So for the first 3 months, Gordon found himself basically stuck in the pastry section, which in France probably isn't that bad of a place to be honest.
Yeah, I'd like that.
Yeah. I think you'd end up being pretty fat. I know I'd end up being pretty fat. But he's also operating sorbet machines, and he's basically got 10 going on at the same time. And it sounds in the book, the way he describes it's kind of like spinning plates. Despite his extensive experience at two of Britain's best restaurants and time spent cooking in the south of France, his French colleagues showed very little interest and actually very little respect. Mostly because he was English, known as a rosbif, which is how the French would pronounce roast beef, and that's throughout the book. But also because his French wasn't very fluent yet. He does obviously become very proficient in French, but he wasn't at that point. So he really had no choice but to sort of just patiently sit and wait his turn and be happy in the spot that he was. He says, "My time as the king of the sorbets was a real test of my patience. I could have gone back to London, taken a nice job with some decent money, but a little voice was telling me to keep going, that the longer I trained, the more that would eventually come my way. In Paris, I learned total respect for food and how cleverly you can make something out of nothing. Take a leak." Not literally. At Harvey's, we would take a 40-inch leek and use about half of it. Half an inch of white stuff to finish a soup or to use as a garnish. The rest of it would be binned. In France, you'd use the best white bit for the soup, but then you'd use the rest for a sauce, or the top of it for a mousse, and then the very top of it you'd use in a staff meal. Nothing went in the bin.
Greg, let me just jump in here. I think this experience is teaching him, it sounds like a real deep respect for his craft, as well as extreme patience, as he mentioned. But again, that focuses on long-term mastery. And the lesson's clear, never be too big to do the small things that matter.
Yeah, that's nicely put. I think you mentioned respect there. I think also respect for ingredients and respect for the, kind of utilizing every part of, in this case, a leek. But I know a lot of chefs talk about utilizing every part of an animal or every part of, whatever is available to them. So he's also learning just simple, good old-fashioned hard graft and work ethic here, Duncan. He says, "I don't care what anyone says. You have to work twice as hard as anyone else if you're an Englishman in a French kitchen. I was first in and last out. And I used to beg him to let me make the staff dinner. The only way I could survive there was to cook my arse off, making sure that I didn't fall down, break down, or cave in. I stood fucking strong. I'd been in Paris for 4 months, and things were moving at 1,000 miles an hour. I was promoted to a senior chef position, and I felt so special. But still, I kept going. I wouldn't take my half day off during the week. We were required to take it by law, but I just wouldn't go. I would come in and work for nothing. I couldn't do the fish because, since it was supposed to be my day off, my number 2 would be working that. So I'd volunteer to go on the veg instead. Of course, my colleagues didn't like this. The little British brown nose. They'd start blanking me or speaking so fast I'd struggle to follow them."
Greg, I love the saying, mediocrity is always invisible until passion shows up and exposes it. I'll say that again. Mediocrity is always invisible until passion shows up and exposes it. And I think this is exactly what he's doing here. He's just a step above what are probably quite talented chefs. And his career is just on a completely different trajectory. And he's showing up and he's exposing them.
Duncan, that's an absolute belter. I love that. That's a great one. So during his time in Paris, he actually returned to London for a cooking competition, which he won as a commis chef among executive chefs. So he was a little bit derided by the executive chefs in that moment, but he cooked his arse off and obviously won the competition. So he comes back to France, very proud, very victorious. And Guy, who runs the kitchen, obviously is delighted with this win and offers him the number 2 position in the kitchen. However, again, Gordon chooses to leave as he realizes he's got more to learn and wants to go elsewhere. So he ends up working for Joel Robuchon. Duncan, this is always an interesting process for me, and we've sort of mentioned it here. This idea of kind of stepping back down the ladder in order to ascend it, right? To quote the great Paula Abdul, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, right? It's not perfect, but you get my meaning. I don't know if we see this in any other performance domains. You just kind of continue up that ladder of trajectory and development in other, certainly in sports.
Or Abdul, I wasn't expecting to hear that tonight.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating because we often assume high performance means that straight climb upwards. His journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest gains are actually acquired when you take a step backwards or even a step sideways. And his willingness to embrace humility here, not a term you'd probably associate with Gordon Ramsay, but he really is. He's embracing that humility to go from winning competitions back to peeling vegetables. That demonstrates an uncommon level of discipline and perspective. He's really thinking the long game. Most people's egos couldn't handle that, but Gordon knew true mastery demands constant reinvention, and he realized he wanted to learn from other people. This process might be unique to chefs, but the principle applies everywhere. Sometimes stepping back is exactly what enables you to leap forward.
Listeners, if you can think of any performance domain that we can't think of where this is kind of a common process as well, we'd love to hear from you. So he's moving to this new restaurant, and Robuchon was the most famous restaurant in the world at the time, and he says it was as snooty as they come, and he definitely says that working there was intense to say the least. He says it was like the fucking SAS. Robuchon made Marco look like a fucking pussycat. It was extraordinary. He was the first chef who was at all like Marco in terms of temperament when in the kitchen. But because he was older and so much more celebrated and accomplished than Marco, I couldn't understand why he was that way. When I joined him, he was 49. 2 weeks later, he announced that he was going to retire within a year. And within 24 hours, the restaurant was fully booked for a year. It was the toughest kitchen in the world, but we were glad to be there. You wanted to get a year of it under your belt. I learned a lot, but perhaps not as much as I did with Guy Savoy. Savoy was hungry. He was pushing for 3 stars. Robuchon was fantastic at the classical stuff, but there wasn't much flair. He wasn't into change. He was into heritage.
Greg, I've used that maxim before. Excellence is the capacity to take pain. I'll say that again. Excellence is the capacity to take pain. And Gordon proves time and time again that he can endure anything and I think it's a big if he's learning from the experience, which he is here.
Yeah, that seems to be the golden thread so far, is he can pretty much endure anything, providing he's getting that experience and that learning from it. I think that's a great point. He says, Robuchon was such an unpleasant person to work for. To the French public, he portrayed himself as cool and sophisticated, the real deal. But in the kitchen, he was just a tyrant, too. If he threw a plate at you, you weren't to expect an apology. After my stint at Robuchon, I knew I was good for nothing, at least not for a while. Physically, I was broken. I had nothing left to give. I needed time out, but that was easier said than done. I couldn't afford not to work. I was beyond broke. Duncan, it sounds like he's learning what to do and maybe what not to do as a head chef along this journey that he's on.
I think his journey vividly illustrates that high performance isn't just absorbing the positives, it's equally identifying behaviors and leadership styles to avoid. And we've seen that in a few of our other coaches' journeys. The intensity of Robuchon's kitchen taught Gordon the value of precision, discipline, and standards, but it also showed him clearly what lines he wouldn't cross himself. Learning what not to do can often be as impactful as learning what to do. And Gordon's experiences here underscore that becoming a great leader involves both lessons.
So he's physically broken, as he says, and he needs a little bit of a change of pace and needs to find something. So he actually goes to work on a mega yacht. It's just a huge, huge boat. And he finds out that it belongs to the legendary Reg Grundy, who is a famous Australian media mogul. And he's the guy that's responsible for the Australian TV hit show Neighbours.
Oh, great show. That's a blast from the past.
You've probably seen his name on that final title slide, but never actually realised who Reg Grundy was. It sounds like a used car salesman. So he says, 40 hours later, I'm sailing off into the sunset on this beautiful mega yacht. It was extraordinary. The kitchen wasn't a galley. It was the size of the kitchen in my house in London, which is to say, massive for a boat. It was all windows and brushed stainless steel. There were 22 crew members, and our salaries were amazing, at least to us. Over this period, I'd saved about £15,000, which seems like a fortune to me, and I'd been running every day, so I was fit again. I was physically and mentally strong, and I felt fantastic. I'd been to Sardinia and Sicily and Corsica. I'd been through Saint-Tropez 20 times, and Monaco about 50. That's where the boat was based. But I also knew that it had to end. This wasn't the real world, and I didn't want to lose sight of reality. However much I was enjoying myself, I was still dying to get back to London and open my own restaurant.
Greg, that sounds like a really nice living if you can do it. It also highlights something else, that Gordon's on a really great wage for him. He's traveling to beautiful places on a mega yacht, and he's prepared to once again leave that all behind to follow his dream and open his own restaurant. Again, this guy is driven and knows exactly where he wants to go.
Yeah, absolutely driven. And the time in charge of the kitchen on the ship has actually helped him to explore and craft his own unique take on food and how he wants that to be. And he says, cooking for the Grundys helped me to develop my style even further, strange as that may sound. They loved food, they adored fine dining, but they were also health conscious. For me, it was extraordinary. I was being paid very well indeed to evolve my own culinary style. You can see the traces of my time on the Idlewood, which is the boat, in the way that I cook now, no question. So he does return to London, and we're jumping ahead in the story here a little bit. Marco Pierre White helps facilitate him getting his own restaurant, which, after starting off as a bistro with what he describes as shit staff, becomes the world famous Aubergine. So over time, many world famous chefs come through that kitchen, and the book reads as a little bit of a name drop. It's just talent after talent after talent in there. But after a mere 4 months of being open in 1995, they get their first Michelin star, and their second came in 1997. Marco Pierre White offered him his own restaurant, which he actually turned down to continue to focus on aubergine. And this was a weird one because Marco took it really personal, and it kind of started a rift and a vendetta between them. So without going into all the details, the management of the restaurant, of which Gordon was a 10% shareholder, that was all a sort of a bit dodgy. It had a little bit of a mafia feel to things. He was partnered with Italian businessmen, and they weren't making sound decisions and wanted to do lots of strange stuff in terms of directions of restaurants. And a lot of rumors were that Marco Pierre White was going to take over Aubergine and that Gordon Ramsay was going to lose everything. So he sort of set about sabotaging Marco, as it were, by disappearing the reservation book, as he put it, for the restaurant and making it look like Marco did it. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but we're talking sort of pre-computer systems in restaurants day. This was a literal book that was the keys to the kingdom, as it were. And he did all of this to basically protect himself, his family, and the business.
Yeah, that's ruthless. I love that. When I heard about it, he's disappearing the reservation book. Lions don't die of old age. They die in the jaws of younger lions. And Marco Pierre White is dying in the jaws of Gordon Ramsay here.
Yeah, he is being very deliberate about it. It was great because he'd make pages of the reservation book appear by sending it from a fax machine at a shop that was close to Marco Pierre White's restaurants as well. So it was making it look like literally, it was very clandestine, very espionage. So this sort of, the rift obviously plays a role, and it kind of comes to a conclusion in a chapter in the book called The Great Walkout, where because of something that Marco Pierre White wanted to do, he wanted to fire Marcus Waring, who was someone that Gordon Ramsay had actually trained up through one of his restaurants. Gordon really got a lot of the staff to support that by getting them to essentially walk out and leave the restaurant up shit creek, is basically the best way to put it. Gordon had been kind of working in the background while all this sort of madness was going on to secure investment for his own place, and he opened that restaurant September 1st, 1998, which was at Gordon Ramsay Royal Hospital Road at the former location of Le Claire, and he ensured everyone who'd supported him and Marcus Waring that had walked out that they would receive jobs at this new venture. Shortly after opening, Ramsay's former restaurant, Aubergine, lost 1 Michelin star, while his new establishment quickly earned 2.
This reads like a thriller.
You're right, it reads like an Agatha Christie novel for sure. So he goes on to say, anyone who wonders just how stressful this period in my life was only has to dig out some old footage of the Channel 4 series Boiling Point, which was filmed around this time. A production company had approached me when I was still at Aubergine about taking part in a series in which a fly-on-the-wall camera would follow a leading chef in his kitchen. In other words, it covered the period just before and just after the split. This was another thing I'd got over on Marco. He was one of the many names they'd considered before choosing me. The series, my first appearance on TV, was a hit, but it was also extremely controversial. Viewers complained in their dozens about my liberal use of the F word. Interesting that he said F word when I've been saying fuck for most of this podcast. And about the way that I treated my staff. They accused me of being a bully, and some professional organisations said that it would put young men and women off the idea of the kitchen as a career. I'm sure it wouldn't seem so shocking now. It's thanks to shows like Boiling Point and Hell's Kitchen that the public has come to understand how tough it is to work in a professional kitchen. But back then, the public knew nothing. They imagine chefs to be ponces with stupid French accents and big white hats. Then again, perhaps I was a little out of control. The pressure must, at some level, have got to me. I remember when I saw the first part of the series myself, in a little screening room. Even I was shocked. They'd got some great footage, but seeing myself on screen for the first time, I thought, fucking hell, is that really me? My language was terrible. Mum was appalled. Duncan, this is where we start to see sort of glimpses into his transition into TV celebrity and certainly into that new performance domain.
Exactly. And what's particularly striking here, Greg, is that Gordon's actually beginning to mirror some of the very behaviors he despised in his mentors, Marco Pierre White and Robichon. It's a powerful example of how easily we can kind of subconsciously adopt the traits, even negative ones, of those who have shaped us, especially under stress. This moment serves as that cautionary tale. To break negative cycles, high performers must not only identify what to emulate from their mentors, but also consciously reject what they don't wish to become.
He goes on, he says, it did, however, have a good effect on business. The phones were soon smoking. 50% of the callers were saying, how can you be such an arsehole? The other 50% were saying, if that's how passionate you are about food, we want to come and eat with you. To be fair, Duncan, 50% of my phone calls are, how can you be such an arsehole?
Yeah, they are. There's no such thing as bad publicity, though, is there, Greg?
No, you're absolutely right about that. He continues. In January 2001, Royal Hospital Road picked up its third Michelin star the same day as my wife handed me the keys to a blue Ferrari 550 Maranello. Lovely as the car was, there's no doubt in my mind which was the greater prize. I'd longed for that third star with every sinew for so long, and now all of my hard work had paid off. This was the ultimate accolade, the definitive recognition. It also meant officially that my restaurant was the best in London because, after a row with the Michelin organisation the previous year, Marco Pierre White and Nico Ladinas both lost their 3-star status. To this day, mine is still the only 3-star Michelin restaurant in London. Duncan, Michelin stars are to chefs what Olympic gold medals are to athletes or what Oscars are to actors. They are symbols of external validation that represent the pinnacle of achievement in their fields, mastery, and just absolute status within their profession. However, like all awards, they do carry the risk of overshadowing the sort of the intrinsic or the internal passion and the purpose that may have first ignited the journey towards excellence. What's your take on this sort of external validation?
External validation is a completely understandable pursuit. After all, everyone wants recognition for their hard work. The key, though, is where does your primary motivation lie? Gordon's story highlights this balance beautifully. While external awards confirm his skill and his effort, but it was his intrinsic motivation, that pure passion for cooking and continual improvement, that really drove his success. It wasn't just about the awards, it was that improvement. And ultimately, performers who thrive the most are those that rely on that inner drive first and then use external validation as a meaningful bonus rather than the sole measure of their worth. I love the saying, never underestimate a man who overestimates himself. I'll say that again. Never underestimate a man who overestimates himself. And Ramsay has that supreme confidence coupled with humility. And I think it's fair to say that you should never underestimate Gordon Ramsay.
I think that is a fair assumption. So he's then asked to take the reins at Claridge's in Mayfair. He says, I was thrilled. For me, this was a big deal. With its old-style glamour, it's a place I've always loved. Plus, its history is unbelievable. Claridge's has been open in one form or another since 1812, and everyone has visited from Queen Victoria to Margaret Thatcher, Donatella Versace to David Beckham. He continues, our customers are not only men in suits on expense accounts. Many of them are women, and lots of them come from out of town. I regard that as a tribute to a fantastic, well-balanced menu. And it was certainly one reason why Claridge's was an immediate hit. In our first week, we received over 500 telephone calls and some 300 faxes requesting reservations. In our second week of trading alone, we welcomed some 1,500 guests. Duncan, as things continue to go from strength to strength here, he also opens other establishments he opens one in Glasgow, which he admits wasn't quite ready for fine dining, which is unsurprising as Scotland is the home of the deep-fried Mars bar.
That's brilliant. Nothing against Scotland, and I'm sure it's come a long way, but I don't think about Scotland as a culinary home to fine dining.
Yeah, I think this was just a little bit ahead of its time there. He also opens up other restaurants, another one in London run by Angela Hartnett, who's gone on to do great things. The Savoy Grill, run by Marcus Waring, who we've mentioned. In addition, he's opened restaurants in Dubai, Tokyo, New York City, Boca Raton, and LA. And he is absolutely actually active in all of these endeavors, which is crazy to think about. He says, every time I open a new restaurant abroad, the critics fill the newspaper with the same old stuff, that I'm spreading myself too thin, that I'm merely putting my name to projects that I can't really control, that this expansion is vanity and money rather than the passion that was behind, say, Aubergine. It's total rubbish, of course. In the weeks building up to an opening, I'm there totally. I am hands-on, putting the chefs through their paces, testing every dish over and over. I'm too much of a control freak to do otherwise. And you see the results both in reviews and the fact that our restaurants remain full long after the initial buzz is over. The other crucial point is that all my chefs are my own. They've worked for me for years. They've worked their way up. I trust them implicitly. I'm not a natural delegator, but that doesn't matter one iota when you're effectively running the best training school in the business. I've got people I can rely on. People ask me, who does the cooking when I'm not there? And my answer is always, the same people who do it when I am there. Duncan, what jumps out to you from this?
It made me reflect on Will Smith's journey, actually, and how he expanded beyond music into acting and producing and even writing. I think at the time, people really questioned his motives and whether he had the talent and whether he was spreading himself too thin. Obviously, in this context, it really requires leadership skills and delegation skills from Gordon Ramsay. Delegation is uncomfortable, as we've seen from some of our coaches like Bill Walsh, and especially for control driven individuals, which I think we can definitely say is Gordon Ramsay. But real excellence requires surrounding yourself with people you trust implicitly, as he says. Gordon's insistence on training and loyalty is exactly why his brand continues to thrive despite skepticism in the press. The takeaway is investing in people and trusting them to execute your vision might be the hardest part, but it's also the most crucial part for scaling and sustained success like he's had across his portfolio, his brand, as it were.
That's why I love doing this podcast. Never in a million years would I think that Bill Walsh and Gordon Ramsay were linked in their lack of ability to delegate. It's crazy that we're able to make that connection. I love that. As we've mentioned, Ramsay's kitchens are definitely a proving ground for aspiring and top chefs alike. And it's all interesting because of the crazy behaviors that are tolerated in that high pressure kitchen environment. But even Gordon Ramsay has some things that are unacceptable. And he describes them. He says, what makes me really pissed off in the kitchen? What makes me explode? Lies. A chef can overcook a scallop. They can overcook a fillet of beef. They can overcook a turbot. But what they can't do is lie about it. That really upsets me. It's not the fact that they're lying to me, they're lying to the customers too. And I won't have that. If there's a cook who's completely transparent and he looks me in the eye and he tells me straight off, yes, chef, that dish went out of the kitchen before I seasoned it, then he's got my trust. He's made a mistake, but at least he's honest. If he lied, if he crossed that line, it would take me years to trust him again. Assuming, that is, I keep him on at all. That's the first thing we teach our chefs, not to lie. Even if it's born of panic, a fear of getting into trouble, that doesn't change the fact that it's a great big lie. I don't want to sound too fucking gourmet about it, but you can't have chefs relying on the idea that the customer will never spot a small mistake. I won't have them ripping the customer off in that way. Also, small mistakes count. A few small mistakes equals one giant cock-up. The second thing that I can't stand is dirty cooks. I want clean trousers, clean hair, clean nails. I want a chef to take pride in his appearance. If he's proud about how he looks, he's proud about how he cooks. All of my chefs are immaculate, no matter how hot the kitchen, no matter how long the shift they've been working. Since we brought in the idea of a chef's table, a table that's right in the heart of the kitchen, where customers can see all the action, this has been more important than ever. We have a chef's table in all our fine dining restaurants now, and they're usually booked for months in advance. They're amazingly popular, especially, ironically, with people who want a bit of privacy for their guests. In 2002, Tony Blair celebrated his 49th birthday at the chef's table in Claridge's. It's also being used by Andrew Lloyd Webber, Richard and Judy, Ronnie Wood, and Kate Moss. That one table alone generates £1 million a year for our company.
Wow.
That's crazy. That's a great way to finish that statement. But there are some really clear leadership principles that jump out from this.
Yeah, and I don't think leadership principles is something our listeners would have thought about when, we started this podcast about Gordon Ramsay, but absolutely, this is a brilliant example of setting clear, non-negotiable standards as a leader. Ramsay knows exactly what he can tolerate, which are mistakes that are made honestly, and what he absolutely can't, which is dishonesty and a lack of pride. He's teaching accountability and integrity and I'd say pride in the details. This kind of leadership clarity creates trust and alignment in high performance environments. He's making it clear that excellence is as much about character, actually, as it is about the skill of cooking itself.
And it obviously comes as no surprise that the staff that work for him do go on to great things. And like I said, many of them are top drawer chefs and restaurateurs in their own right. This is really important to Gordon to give people that leg up. He says, the way I see it, cooking has given me the most amazing career and a million opportunities that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Once they're on it, I want them to keep moving up it. More to the point, I need them to run the business as it grows. I always worry that good people will leave or be poached, but once they're partners, once they have a stake in the business, that gets less and less likely.
Greg, I love this. Restock the stream that you fish from. Gordon's just, constantly giving back to his profession.
Man, you're absolutely on fire with these maxims tonight.
Yes, I am.
Yes, yeah, that's what you do. It's what I do. Obviously, he's got this great staff in the kitchen, but even with that great staff, he really does want to be hands-on as well. He says, so how often am I in the kitchen myself? Well, in spite of the business and all of the travel, my TV commitments, the recipes I write for the Times and my books, and all the other millions of other demands on my time, I'm still heavily drawn to my restaurants 3 to 4 nights a week at Royal Hospital Road and 3 to 4 lunches. Royal Hospital Road is the top restaurant, but only has 12 tables. That's 40 seats. It's closed at weekends, and that's the same team for lunch and the same team for dinner. There are no earlies, no lates, no alternative weekends. It's systematic. It's foolproof. It's a perfect space. It's like eating inside a fucking Chanel handbag. He says, it's a really nice way to put it. He says, what makes a 3-star Michelin restaurant? Consistency. Every night must be the same performance-wise. People tend to say, God, Christmas must be a nightmare for you. No, that's wrong. January is the same as December. May is the same as March. The menu's seasonal and it changes between every 9th and 12th week. We change half the dishes one week, the rest the next, but nothing must be left to chance because this is the jewel in our crown. Duncan, talk to me a little bit about the importance of consistency in high performance domains.
In elite performance, Greg, whether it's sports, business, or the kitchen of a 3-star Michelin restaurant, consistency is the foundation of greatness. Gordon Ramsay's meticulous approach to his flagship restaurant, his insistence on systematic precision, relentless quality control, and what I'd say is an unyielding commitment to routine echoes the very principles that separates champions from the rest. True excellence isn't about having one great performance, it's about having the same elite performance over and over again.
Well, that's all well and good, but how do you do that?
So when I think about the conceptualization of consistency, I think about 3 things, and they're often used as synonyms, but I think there's some differences here. And I think about routines, habits, and systems that really can work together to create consistency in high performance. Routines provide that structured repetition, ensuring kind of key actions are performed the same way each time. If we can think about sport, it might be a pre-performance routine before you throw a basketball 3-throw or a tennis serve. Habits make these actions automatic, reducing that kind of mental effort and variability. So it's the habits that you have leading up to the routines. And then systems are really about organization and the standardization of performance, really ensuring that repeatability and I'd say allowing for strategic refinement. Together, ultimately, that eliminates guesswork, creates some stability under pressure, and makes excellent not just possible, but sometimes inevitable. So I think there is a recipe to consistency.
Yeah, recipe. Nice pun there. I see what you've done. So, Duncan, I'd hazard a guess that not many, if any at all, of our listeners have actually eaten in a Gordon Ramsay restaurant.
Well, I have.
Oh, have you? Sorry, I forgot you were big time.
Yeah, I ate at Gordon Ramsay's burger restaurant in Qatar.
Oh, of course. That's just casual, isn't it? Who hasn't done that? And?
It was bang average, to be honest.
I didn't know you were an official Michelin inspector.
I've eaten a few burgers in my life.
Definitely things to compare it against. So you wouldn't recommend people jump on a flight to Qatar to eat at Gordon Ramsay's burger restaurant.
No, but I am willing to go to some of his other restaurants if Gordon would like to invite us.
Likewise, there is one in St. Louis where I'm currently situated. So, Gordon, please send me an email, and I will happily clear my calendar for it.
He probably won't after this.
No, I probably won't slagging him off. You and your burger talk. Again, this book was published a while ago, so there are numerous business ventures, restaurants, TV shows, and accolades that were sort of yet to come. However, we will close with his reflection on an accolade that he is very, very proud of. In early July 2006, he is awarded an OBE from the Queen. And he says, "This award means a huge amount to me. It's just a little outside confirmation of how far I've come, that I'm doing okay. But the most important thing about it was that it was awarded to me for my services to the industry. It had nothing to do with my television work. I think that pleased me more than anything. I felt amazingly proud. People often ask me whether there'll ever be a day when I've got enough restaurants in my group and enough Michelin stars under my belt. The answer to both questions is no. As far as the restaurants go, while the quality's maintained, we'll keep on opening. The important thing for people to realise is that Gordon Ramsay Group isn't a chain. It's a fantastic collection of individual talents. With regards to Michelin stars, Alain Ducasse has got 3 sets of 3-starred restaurants in New York, Monaco, and Paris. So it's definitely possible. That's my goal. And I predict Thomas Keller, the American chef, will have 2 lots of 3 stars. So, if anything, I feel like I'm lagging behind. I'm underachieving. I look at Ducasse and Keller and think, I've got work to do. Luckily, I've got time on my side. I've got 10 years on them. And my guys want it as well. They're hungry. What people who are cynical about our expansion fail to grasp is that we don't level out and fizzle. We just get better and better. And that is where we'll leave it. But Duncan, as always, success leaves clues. What are your top 10 life lessons from Humble Pie by Gordon Ramsay?
My top 10 life lessons from Humble Pie by Gordon Ramsay. Number 1, hard work beats talent. Success isn't about luck or talent, it's about relentless effort and an obsession with improvement. And he said, my life is about keeping the wolf from the door. It's about hard work. It's about success. Number 2, use pain as motivation. Sometimes success is about proving others wrong. Ramsay's difficult childhood drove him to create the life he never had. Speaking about his dad, everything he did, I was determined to do the opposite. Number 3, take the leap before you're ready. High performers don't wait for the perfect moment. They take action and figure it out along the way. Speaking of his initial conversation with Marco, he said, I phoned him up then and there. And then Marco said, then come and see me tomorrow morning. Number 4, growth requires sacrifice. To reach the top, you have to leave comfort behind. Ramsay gave up financial security to train with the best. I had a massive sense of purpose. This was where I was meant to be, speaking of his time in Paris. Number 5, set non-negotiable standards. If you compromise on quality once, you'll do it again. True professionals never lower their standards. And he said, I may have been a bit slow, but at least they weren't rubber eggs. That's great. Number 6, do the work no one else will. The best separate themselves by taking on the toughest, least glamorous tasks to prove their value. And he said, I used to beg him to let me make the staff dinner. Number 7, own your own career path. If you don't take control of your journey, someone else will. Ramsay left toxic environments and took risks to build his future. And he said, I needed to spread my wings if I was ever going to become the kind of cook I desperately wanted to be. Number 8, trust is built on honesty. Mistakes happen, but lying destroys trust and credibility. Owning up to errors earns respect. And he says, a chef can overcook a fillet of beef, but what they can't do is lie about it. Number 9, consistency creates greatness. The best in the world don't rely on inspiration. They build habits and systems to make excellence repeatable. Every night must be the same performance. Nothing must be left to chance. And number 10, never stop pushing. True high performers are never satisfied. No matter how much Ramsay achieved, he is always chasing the next level. I look at Alan Ducasse and Thomas Keller and think, I've got work to do. Luckily, I've got time on my side.
Duncan, as always, that is a wonderful list, but not everything's always rosy. So, what are the top 10 behaviors to avoid from Humble Pie by Gordon Ramsay?
Number 1, letting your past define you. Where you come from doesn't dictate where you go. Ramsay refused to let his father's failure shape his future. He said, later, my feelings for him hardened into hatred. I never wanted to follow him in his footsteps. Number 2, waiting for the right moment. If you wait until you feel ready, you'll never take the leap. Opportunity favors those who move fast. And he said, I wasn't sure what to say, so I told him, I'm about to go to France because I want to learn how to cook properly. Have you got a job there? No, not yet. Then come to see me tomorrow morning. Again, a conversation with Marco. Number 3, avoiding hard work. The road to mastery is brutal, and those unwilling to embrace the grind get left behind. First in, last out, that's how you survive. Number 4, accepting poor standards. Cutting corners is the fastest way to mediocrity. If you tolerate bad work, it becomes your reputation. I got written up for refusing to serve bad food. Number 5, lying to cover mistakes. Mistakes can be corrected, dishonesty can't. Lying erodes trust and credibility. If he lied, I wouldn't trust him again. Number 6, staying where you aren't growing. If you stopped learning, you stop progressing. The best seek out challenges that force them to improve. The trouble was that Marco made you feel as though there was nothing outside of Harvey's, that nowhere else mattered. That was just not true. Number 7, ignoring your own standards. Standing by your principles, even when it's inconvenient, is what separates the great from the average. Number 8, choosing short-term comfort over long-term growth. Mastery takes patience and sacrifice. Those who chase easy wins never reach their full potential. A little voice told me to keep going. Number 9, surrounding yourself with the wrong people. Your environment shapes your future. Learning from toxic leaders teaches you what not to become. Roachon was a tyrant. I learned what not to be. And finally, number 10, thinking you've made it. The truly great never stop evolving. Every achievement is just a stepping stone to the next challenge. People ask me whether there'll be a day when I've got enough restaurants or enough Michelin stars. The answer to both questions is no. Thank you so much for joining myself and Greg on this episode. If you've enjoyed the episode, please consider supporting the show by clicking the link in the show notes, or at least share this amazing podcast with people you know. See you next time on Performers.